Good afternoon, everyone. It's about 2:02, so I think we're ready to get started. On behalf of the Arizona Center for Civic Leadership, welcome to a CivEx session on the state of Arizona nonprofits. I'm Matt Ellsworth, Vice President of Communications at the Flinn Foundation, and a board member at Arizona Grantmakers, whose members, of course, have a special interest in the nonprofit sector. First, I want to tell you that this session is being recorded. We'll post the video to our site and to YouTube after the meeting. As we begin, we'd like to get a better sense of who's with us today. So on your screen, you'll see 3 poll questions. The first of these is, do you currently work in the nonprofit sector? Okay. The second question is, what sector do you represent? And the third, what area of the state are you joining us from? Okay, thank you. Now I have the pleasure of introducing a true expert on the nonprofit sector, Kristen Merrifield, CEO of the Alliance of Arizona Nonprofits. Over the past decade, Kristen has emerged as one of Arizona's most impactful community leaders. At the Arizona Small Business Association, she served members in several roles before becoming that organization's chief operating officer. Since 2015, she's been CEO of the Alliance of Arizona Nonprofits, which works to unite, strengthen, and advance our diverse and enormous nonprofit sector. Her team supports more than 1,000 member organizations with capacity building, public policy advocacy, and much more, including Arizona Gives Day, which is coming next week on April 6th. So Kristen, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Matt. Thank you to the entire team at Flinn Foundation for having me today. I'm really pleased to be here to give you an update on some of the latest things that are coming out around the impact that COVID has had on all of our operations and strategy throughout the past year. It's great to have many of our members on the call today and the rest of you that I would love to be meeting in person, but of course we are still facing many challenges. Even though things are turning up, there's still a lot of reasons that we wouldn't want to be gathering today. So thank you to the Flinn Foundation for bringing this together online. So today we are going to have a great panel discussion after I'm done. So you'll get to meet our other panelists a little bit later, but I'm going to kick things off today with a look a year later at what COVID-19's impact has been on the nonprofit sector in Arizona. And we thought it would be helpful just to lay the groundwork, especially for those of you that have not been in the nonprofit sector a long time, maybe have never seen this information, or especially for those of you that are not working within the sector here in Arizona. The Alliance, along with our partners, the Lodestar Center, Robert is on the line today with many other partners who I will not try to remember a name, partnered together to do actually a set of 2 reports, one of which was released, I believe, in 2016, and then again in 2018, looking at the economic impact of nonprofits. And then the second report actually took it a step further to look at the social impact. So sometimes folks find this a bit surprising. So I wanted to lay the groundwork of how big the sector is, how diverse it is, and what its impact is here in Arizona. So we do have over 22,000 nonprofits. This was back in 2016, so that number has probably grown. And you can see that we have them in all different counties, in rural Arizona, of course, with our concentrations being in, the largest populated parts of Arizona, which is not surprising because, of course, there's a lot of individuals that then would need services. So there's one nonprofit for every 303 Arizonans. Compared to some of the other states, that is a little bit higher than some of our colleagues. So a lot of organizations doing a lot of really good work throughout the state. And this just gives an idea. There are, of course, different types of nonprofits. Some of us think of charitable organizations just in the health and human services lane, but arts and culture, environment, animal welfare, hospitals and higher ed are also included in the nonprofit, education, religious-based, et cetera. So there are quite a few different types of nonprofits, and you can kind of see some of the concentrations there of how many organizations fall in those categories. When we start talking about the economic impact of the sector, it's important that we consider both of our roles, one being the direct effect of a nonprofit. So a nonprofit employs people, they're paying wages, they buy supplies from local companies, and they actually do pay taxes. There are taxes that the nonprofits pay into the state as well. But then there's this indirect effect. So because an organization hires workers, then their vendors can also pay their employees. They can purchase supplies. Their employees can then go into the community and spend those dollars. So there's an indirect effect to that, as well as an induced effect. So when you think about it, there are actually some numbers that directly relate to nonprofits' activities here in Arizona, and then there's the indirect or induced effect. So when you look in terms of employment, this is often an interesting one for folks to realize that the Arizona nonprofit sector directly employs 171,000 Arizonans. That's probably, again, somewhat higher since this was a few years ago now at this point. But when you think about the jobs that they then create because of their activity, it's actually 332,000 jobs that the nonprofit sector is responsible for. In terms of wages, we pay $8.3 billion in wages. Indirect and induced adds another $6.7 billion for a total of $14.9 billion in wages. And then the gross state product, so how we're contributing to the economy here in Arizona, we directly generate $10.9 billion in revenue. That could be from fees for services, it could be fundraising, all kinds of different ways that nonprofits can generate revenue. And so that total with those combined is just over $23 billion. And then the very surprising one sometimes is that we do definitely contribute to our state and local taxes. There are many taxes that nonprofits do pay. There are some that we don't, but that contribution directly is at $1.2 billion. So really some big numbers. So when things like COVID happen, it's really important for us and our stakeholders, our legislators, the media, et cetera, to understand that it's not just the impact of the good work that the nonprofit is doing in the community. We also are a major employer, a major economic engine, just like our small business colleagues, those in tourism, hospitality. We want to make sure that the nonprofit sector is also positioned as having an impact in these areas as well. And this is just giving you a percentage overall based on the numbers that I just told to you. And this slide deck will be available for you afterwards, so you can refer to this information at your leisure as well. This is the really interesting part because, the numbers are one thing, and if you don't have context, it's kind of hard to know, is that big, is that small? So in terms of employment, the sector as a whole, the nonprofit sector, is the 5th largest non-government employer in the state of Arizona. We actually have about 37,000 more direct jobs than the construction industry, and we directly pay more wages than construction, the wholesale trade, or accommodation and food services. So again, when you've seen related to COVID, a lot of folks talking about the impact to restaurants, the impact on different industries, the nonprofit sector has got to be right there in the middle because we are definitely a major contributor in many areas. And then we are the 8th biggest direct contributor to our gross state product. So a big deal for sure that we need to all rally together to support. So you can find that full, both of those studies and several other studies from some of our partners at our website. There's the website there, along with the direct link to take you right to those studies. I wanted to mention too that you are welcome to use the question box here in Zoom if you'd like to start submitting questions. We are going to have some time throughout the presentation that we will address those. So as questions pop up in your mind, feel free to put those in the Q&A box and we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. All right, so jumping into now what COVID's impact has been on the nonprofit sector in Arizona. The Alliance has actually done probably, 4 to 5 surveys over the past year, looking at the impact that COVID has had on our nonprofits directly, and then also, of course, on their ability to fulfill their mission. We did one in early March when all of us were just realizing that the world as we know it was changing, which was staggering because all of those fundraisers overnight had been canceled. People were having to struggle to figure out what to do in terms of the stay-at-home order and how that was impacting. We did another follow-up one in June and several others on different topics. But this one we just finalized. So you're the first group that's actually getting to hear this. It is available on our website already. So a year later, now it's been 12 months since the world started falling apart. And how is the nonprofit sector looking? This was a quote from one of our survey respondents. They lost 84% of their funding. There are a lot of nonprofit organizations that rely on these fundraisers. They may have a very large annual event that funds them throughout the year, and a lot of our fundraisers were happening in spring. It's a beautiful time in Arizona, and a lot of those events overnight had to be canceled or converted to online giving. So we asked them about closures. Obviously many of us had to close, but the nonprofits that were on the front lines serving the community actually remained open. 74% of nonprofits did say that they closed their physical location in some way. And so this was from about 410 respondents, and their closure ranged anywhere from 1 to 3 months to the 43% that actually remained closed. Now, some of them may be closed only to outside visitors. Some of them may be closed to everyone. Their staff is still remote, so there's different levels of closures. And you can see all the full information if you download the full report. But, this next bullet point speaks to the resiliency of our sector. Although many had to close their physical locations, less than 1% stopped providing services. They learned how to create opportunities to provide those services online, virtual options, and also implementing the various COVID mitigations like social distancing, masking up, gloves, everything in order to be able to still provide those services to the community. And of course, no surprise, some organizations, which many of you probably are nodding your heads, are also considering changing how the work looks moving forward, with about 54% of nonprofits considering moving towards a hybrid or remote in-person plan. So I've been asked often, especially by our friends in the media, what are some lessons learned or best practices that have come out of this pandemic? And it's hard to look at positives, right, with something like COVID. But some of the things that we're hoping continue, nonprofits have learned to be a lot more efficient. They've learned that they can do online things that they may have never thought they could. Fundraising being one big thing, which has worked well for some and not so great for others, but even providing services in a virtual format. Some of them may have never considered it. Some may have not had the technology, and so they've been able to get investments or funding to get the technology they need. So we're hopeful that some of those things will continue moving forward, making services available to even more. I know just for the Alliance, we weren't doing a lot online. We weren't doing a lot of training, a lot of, our conference and things like that. And we found that providing those online options have actually made our services much more accessible to a wider audience, especially for our organizations that can't travel to Phoenix for everything. This next slide has to do with staff and volunteers. The concern is burnout, where you see this quote from a colleague nonprofit, more, people doing less with more, things like that, especially when folks who have been, needed to be out sick or caring for their children, or folks who were vulnerable or who had contracted COVID. So when you look here at the percent of staff that were furloughed or laid off, you had about a little over 25% that laid off between 1 and 10% of their employees. What was more shocking to see was, a little over 25% laid off 76 to 100% of their team members. So we do know that there are a lot of organizations that are 100% volunteer. In fact, when you look at that study that I talked about in the very beginning, there's actually just under 3,000 organizations out of those 22,000 right back in 2016 that actually have at least one paid employee or more. So when you think about that and how many nonprofits there are, a ton of work is being done by volunteers. And so when we looked at the volunteers that had been lost, I think this report put it in the 70,000 range number of volunteers. That's something that's even more concerning, as volunteers are still concerned, right, of doing things in person. They may be elderly, they may be youth. So there's definitely a desire to figure out, how do we engage volunteers to continue to help us do the work. In terms of hiring new employees, nearly 50% have held off on hiring. And those that did increase hiring was definitely overwhelmingly programmatic in nature. They had, maybe they were in the front lines, they were in the health and human services sector, and they actually had an increased need. I talk a lot to the media about, something to keep in mind in terms of when a recession happens. In the for-profit sector, you see revenue go down, but you also see demand go down. In the nonprofit sector, a lot of times, especially for those in certain cause areas, revenue goes down, but demand actually goes up. So those that were hiring were needing to fill an increased need and may have had access to emergency funding to do so. So here's those numbers, 73,000 or 78% of their volunteers lost. Again, some of the silver lining coming out of this is that 44% of organizations were able to create some sort of virtual opportunities. So using Zoom like we're using today, or working on projects at home. About 39% of nonprofits said they have brought back in-person volunteer opportunities, many of them with those COVID mitigations that we talked about earlier, while 14% never stopped. So again, there's some nonprofits that have remained open, have remained, engaging in person. I think of the food banks, we had in-person opportunities to continue to help food banks. So there were some of them that never stopped those operations. However, 79% of organizations said they're not yet back, though, to pre-COVID volunteer numbers. And then the loss in revenue. So the average nonprofit lost between 26 and 50% of their revenue due to COVID. We did specifically make sure to ask that this was indeed due to COVID and not other factors. So the total revenue loss was just over 91 million. Again, this is only from 400 nonprofits. So that is a huge number. Of course, you've got the very, very tiny nonprofits that maybe, they spend $1,000 or $2,000 a year. So it ranged from a few $100s of impact up to our larger organizations that reported losing upwards of $5 million. So you've got quite a range here. And probably not surprising to those of you that are in the arts and culture sector, the biggest loss was there, right? Because these organizations, most of them were unable to open their doors or have not been able to reopen, and they rely on earned income. So that's been really difficult, especially also with fundraising dollars potentially shifting to basic human needs. Not that that is surprising, but it's the facts of the matter that some of those dollars that arts and culture organizations or some of these other organizations receive on a normal basis have shifted to other purposes. One thing that we were really looking at is year-end giving. We were, thinking, we normally see about a 30% or 31% increase in giving, or 31% of giving happening in December or around Giving Tuesday and end of year. And so we were hopeful that we would see a very positive trend, that we would maybe allow nonprofits to recoup some of what they lost earlier in the year. And on average, according to the survey, 52% of nonprofits saw a decrease in year-end giving, being down from 11 to 25% from previous years. So again, 48% either said, it stayed the same, or they might have actually got an increase. So there's always the flip side of that coin. But that's how we saw year-end giving fare. So some nonprofits, were able to, have a very positive year-end, but others, it kind of was on par for what they saw in giving throughout the rest of the year. This is a quote from one of the nonprofits in terms of the increased expenses. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of nonprofits that have had such a higher demand. And unfortunately, domestic violence was one of those areas that there have been increases in the number of domestic violence incidents. And this was from one of our nonprofits where their founder took a job actually to be able to help fund more of the escapes from domestic violence, and has actually had to use her own paycheck to then fund some of that. So again, speaks to the incredible passion, the incredible dedication of our nonprofit professionals. I applaud all of you for all the heroic things that you've had to do, either to take care of those that you serve or to take care of your own employees. There are many other examples like this as well. So in terms of increased expenses, this is that flip side of the coin, right? We had to also increase the amount of money we were spending, either because there was an increased need or also on things like PPE. I doubt very highly that many of us had PPE in our line item unless we were in the medical field or a very specified reason we had that. Now it probably is in your 2021 budget. So the other thing was technology. Having to switch everything to online. Did we have the right computers? Could our people work from home? Did we need iPads for our youth? Whatever it might be, those were the main areas of increases. So education and youth saw a really high increase in those. You know, a lot of things had to surround around kids not being in school. So there may have been additional lunches, additional breakfasts or food or backpacks or technology where they had to do tutoring or all those things. So they saw the highest increase in terms of technology and PPE and things like that because of the increased need. Some people that give direct dollar assistance for rent, utilities, all of those things went up. And so there was an additional strain of about 15 million that was reported by those 400 nonprofits. And I know I'm getting right around the time where I'm going to start taking some questions, but I know Nora is going to talk a little bit more about this in our panel discussion. But some of the things that we have seen is actually an increase in the organization's ability to shift to virtual services, but also rethinking the ways that we've done things in the past. And this was a quote from another survey respondent that we see that the community is now figuring out how to work collaboratively more and work together and having an openness to those conversations, whereas before it might have just been focused on, you know, we're going to do our things in our lane and keep moving forward. But now we've been forced to really rethink and to create some more strategic alliances to do the things we need to do. And we asked the organizations, you know, what do you really need? What needs to happen for you to continue to stay afloat? And those nonprofits that are on the line are not going to be shocked, but probably excited to at least see this mentioned, that the resounding response by 81% was we need unrestricted funding. And they were very appreciative of funders who had been able to make that shift and unrestrict dollars maybe that they'd already given, so that the nonprofits could use those dollars the way that they needed to, because things are constantly changing, not just in a time of COVID, but all the time. And we need to be able to respond to those community needs. So that was something that definitely we still need to continue. And we work together with our partners in funding and philanthropy to share that feedback. And then 44% said they also still plan to maintain some sort of virtual presence or offerings, even when it's no longer necessitated by COVID. So you can download the full report right now at arizonanonprofits.org/COVID-19. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop share on my screen and see if we have any questions that we'd like to address in the Q&A box. And I don't see any here, but if you do have any questions, you can submit those. And if anyone from the Flynn team would like to pop on and just let me know if you see any that I'm not seeing. I know that I haven't used the Q&A box very often. That would be great. All right, so I've got one question here. Are you hearing nonprofits talk about keeping their organizations completely remote or getting out of leases and co-locating with other organizations? Yes, absolutely. That's another thing that folks have been looking at differently is, do they really need a physical space? Or does it make more sense to stay 100% remote or have a smaller footprint? So yes, we absolutely have seen nonprofits looking at that, especially if their lease was expiring. They were looking at, I know one of the examples is the YWCA organization, I know I talked to Debbie Esparza there, and they made that consideration. We've gotten several emails from nonprofits looking to help us, match make and say, hey, do you know of anybody that has additional space? Or someone might say, hey, we have additional space because half of our team is going to work remotely for the future, and maybe there's another nonprofit that we could co-locate for. The other thing that we had to jump in and help with as well is negotiating or renegotiating the contracts for space for events. A lot of nonprofits are also relooking at the way they fundraise. There's a lot of dollars and time and resource that goes into the galas, the golf tournaments. And I think there always will be a place for in-person fundraising. There's a magic that happens in the room, but they're also realizing that a lot can be done online. And so they're integrating that maybe for the first time into their strategy. And yes, the presentation will be shared afterwards, so you'll have full access to that as well. Another question that we have come through, what are some examples of virtual volunteer opportunities? Wanting to keep volunteers engaged but having trouble coming up with ideas. So I would definitely say that, some nonprofits are creating kits. Maybe they need things put together, backpacks stuffed, cards sent out, different things like that. And so they've arranged either to get those to the volunteers, mail them out, or have them come pick them up in a kind of curbside, no contact. There's a lot of corporate volunteer programs that have also been doing things like that, where they actually are able to do it from home. With the introduction of technology, so maybe people who provided mentoring, coaching, training, those kind of things that they utilize volunteers for, they're definitely using Zoom and other platforms to allow the volunteers to do that from home. So I think it would depend, on the type of things that you need done. A lot of times, right, the only way to do them is in person. Definitely I would say reach out to your colleague nonprofits that are in the same cause area as you, and I'm sure they'd be willing to share some of the ideas that they've been doing in order to get that done virtually. And I see some of the chat is sharing, thanks Catherine, that they have virtual volunteering to teach students. Yeah, that's great. Another question I had, was there any data on what end users for different types of nonprofits want to see moving forward in terms of the balance between virtual and in-person events and fundraising? So yeah, so kind of seeing, what does the community need, or what does your audience need? We didn't ask any of that in the survey, but I think that's so important, and it's something we've talked about at the Alliance, because we have conversations, right, and I'm sure you do, of when should we start offering in-person opportunities? And one of my team members, much wiser than I, said, well, we should probably first ask if anyone wants to come to them, right? It's one thing to say we're going to offer it and we have these social distancing and masks and all these things, but if folks are not ready and comfortable yet to do that, then it probably doesn't make sense. And I think depending on who your audience is, it's probably going to also dictate that. Like, if you serve an elderly population, or you serve for example, young folks who do not have access to the vaccine, young children, I think it will just depend on who your audience is. And I would definitely say, yes, it's important to survey them, or to have focus groups or conversations to allow them to say when they are going to be comfortable returning to an in-person environment, because the last thing you want to do is expend time, energy, dollars, and resources, and then find out that your audience is actually not quite in the same space maybe that you are as an organization. So great questions. All right, so if you have additional questions, you can keep them locked and loaded. I'm going to go ahead though and move forward to our panel discussion for the day. So I'm very happy to introduce our wonderful panel of professionals, experts, passionate individuals serving our community. And so I'll ask you, as I introduce you, if you want to go ahead and turn your camera on. We've got Dr. Robert Ashcraft. He's the Executive Director for the Lodestar Center for Philanthropy and Nonprofit Innovation at Arizona State University. Thanks for being here, Robert.
My pleasure.
We've got Nora Hanna, the Director of Arizona Together for Impact Fund, who is also a 2011 Flinn-Brown Fellow. Thanks for being with us, Nora.
You bet.
We've got Naketa Ross, Executive Director of ResilientMe Inc, a 2019 Flinn-Brown Fellow. Thanks for being here, Naketa.
Thank you for having me.
And then also Elyse Guidas, Executive Director of Activate Food Arizona, a 2019 Flinn-Brown Fellow. Thanks for being with us, Elyse. So we're going to open up and start by asking our nonprofit folks that are here to talk to us about how your work has been impacted over the last year. A very general question, but I'm sure you've got much to share. So I'm going to go ahead and go to Naketa first, if you'd like to answer that, and then Elyse, I'll come to you as well.
So we've been impacted greatly. We provide a direct service to our clients. We work with youth in foster care, and we go to them to provide our service. And so when COVID hit and we were not allowed to go unless you were an essential worker, we had to decide, are we essential? We had to have that discussion. So that was the first impact. We had to sit down and say, are we essential? Like, how vital are our services to these young adults that we work with every day? And so we continue to work with our youth, but we pivot or try to pivot to online or virtual, and that was not as successful as we wanted it to be. So our young adults don't have laptops, so we had to figure out how to do that, and they didn't have consistent internet access. We had to figure that out. And so it has impacted us in forcing us to think about how we provide our service in this new world. That was one of the things. We had to prioritize what was absolutely necessary and what could we change and or stop doing, because we weren't able to provide the same level or the same amount of services that we were pre-COVID. So yes, we had a huge impact in services. And then also financially, we do have a couple of in-person fundraisers that we do. And we do one in the spring. We do a kickball event. And of course, we couldn't do that. And so we had events that we do in person that we had to cancel. So COVID has impacted us. I like, as you were talking, Kristen, you kept saying the positive side. So the positive side is that it did that prioritize and helped us to say, okay, what are the things that we do that are absolutely important? And it kind of helped us, I can't think of a better expression, but trim the fat away, I guess. I know there's a better expression than that, and I'm sorry if that's at all offensive, but it helped us like just be really lean in the services we provide. And I'm really looking forward to hearing how it impacted Elyse.
Thank you, Naketa. I have to agree. It gave you the opportunity to probably try some things that maybe you hadn't wanted to try before, but it's kind of that forced innovation that we've seen happen with a lot of nonprofits. So trying, learning, and then trying again. So yeah, thank you so much for that answer. Elyse, how are things going with you?
Hi, thank you. They're going okay. I think it's always one of those like, it depends questions. But yeah, so our organization actually did a major shift in our focus midway through 2019. And we spent the second half of 2019 writing our first ever strategic plan to identify new expansion routes for our food work. So Activate Food Arizona really works directly with communities to help develop food system solutions in spaces that have barriers to access to food. We really work with community members who experience food insecurity to help them create systems that make sense for them. So community-based, community-led. And for the last 7 years, we've run a program called Farm Express, which is a mobile produce market that goes around to communities and provides high quality, affordable access to fruits and vegetables. So we had started our strategic plan. Farm Express was kind of moving along as best it could with our small little fleet of buses. And then the pandemic hit right when we had kind of finalized our strategic plan. We were launching this kind of expanded version of our work. And so it shifted everything immediately, went to a halt. We grounded our buses in the beginning because we were going to senior communities and we didn't have PPE. And, in those early days, it was kind of just a panic of how are we going to provide this service if we can't even keep our staff safe. I have staff members who take public transportation, and I didn't feel comfortable just saying, okay, get on a bus and a light rail and we'll just hope you make it, right? So we really we really took a step back. I'm a public health professional first. That's where my background and training is. And I didn't have the answers in order to feel safe putting my team out there. So we waited. And the interesting thing about being in mobile food work is that we have this vehicle that on its surface feels like this very easy solution to go out in the community, but we can't have people on our mobile markets. It's 120 degrees outside and we serve vulnerable populations. And so for a while, we couldn't figure out a safe and easy way to get food to people despite the tremendous need. So it really caused us, again, I like that forced innovation, but really it meant that we had to constantly reevaluate what success meant. And we were very fortunate to have funders who were also going through that and understood that. But it meant that success could look like keeping our staff alive. And that was a really big thing for me to like put that hat on and say, I'm relatively new to running this nonprofit as is, and now I've got to weather this storm through a pandemic and make sure that our staff are safe. We were able to modify our service with some funding. We participated in AZ Gives Day for the first time last year, and we were able to create a no contact drop produce program through the summer last year to really get the most vulnerable customers the food that they needed, and then just overlay with them with resources. What are the food banks doing? What are the other food partners that we work with doing? How do we get as much food to these communities as possible? And we relaunched our mobile markets in November with enhanced safety protocols in place. It's a lot easier to socially distance outside in November than in August. And so we were able to come up with a model that is working, but we are not back to our full route. It's changed considerably. And I think community food has changed considerably. One, because there's so much need, but also just because there's so many resources from different places that we are still having to figure out what makes sense for our group and for our team. I think on a personal level, because in nonprofit, you often can't decouple personal and professional, right? Is wrestling with the guilt of not doing enough the whole time is integral to the work and how we adapted in COVID. So, I really struggled in those early days of watching the partners that I work with just turn on a dime and be able to serve. And I was having this crippling anxiety that like our team can't meet the needs that we kind of set out to do. And I had to work through that and realize that those are established teams of 10 plus years that have 50 employees, and we had 3. And so it took us some time to pivot. I am grateful for how resilient we are in the long run. And I'm grateful that we had the flexibility to just keep our staff home and keep them safe while we figured out this new normal. So yeah, we're still kind of in it. We are making our way through it. Conversations in rural communities with regard to food are starting again, but they are slow go. And we're kind of bumping up against that. There's only so much we can do in Zoom. The next part is going to see a community, going to build those connections, relationships. And there are places where it still doesn't feel okay or right to go into a smaller community and potentially put those resources at risk. So we are kind of taking it as a day by day approach and just doing the best to keep, our wheels on the ground, pun intended, and to keep our program kind of afloat for now.
Thanks so much, Elyse. I totally agree. I mean, you're thinking about capacity, and what is really doable and possible in an environment where there's a lot of uncertainty, about the resources you're going to have. Are you going to have the financial resources? Are you going to have the team members that you need? Because everyone, you're right. I mean, for the first time, not just in nonprofits, but in our entire world, we had this very much blurred line of personal, professional, home, and work. Right? We just thought we talked about work-life balance before, but when you're actually working in your home, then it creates all of these other unknown factors. So I applaud you for what you've been able to do during this time. And one of the important things to consider, and I've talked to the media about this before, is, some of our surveys toward the end of last year showed that, nonprofits had certain resources to last, 3 months, even up to 12 months. And they said, well, we feel like everything's okay. It seems like everything's okay. Everybody's doing okay. They've adjusted to this new normal. And I said, the problem is the new normal that we have adjusted to in the nonprofit sector is a reduced capacity new normal. So while we may have righted the ship in terms of we've learned how to do less with more once again, we also are not able to provide as many services as we could if we were fully staffed, fully volunteered, had the resources that we needed. So we want to make sure that we don't get into that lull of, yeah, we're doing okay now, right? We've kind of learned how to do this, but at what expense to the community that really relies on us? So thanks for that, Elyse. I want to move over to Nora. Hannah, thanks for being with us. And we did have a question actually that kind of, they knew you were coming. And I'll wait for that here in a second, but I think you'll probably address it. What trends have you noticed in nonprofits across Arizona last year? And then I'll kind of save some of my other follow-up questions afterwards.
You bet. So, as you know, we just launched the Together for Impact initiative at the end of 2019. And, 4 months later, we're in COVID. So it was very interesting. And we're part of, we formed sort of a national network of initiatives. There's about 7 other cities that do this work. And everyone was expecting that we would be deluged with, the hard-hitting impact on the nonprofit sector of COVID. And that really has not been the case. I have to say, sort of good news and bad news around COVID for the work we do. One of the things that has happened is, I think I've always been a little bit cynical about this expression, we're in this together. We're all in this together. When it didn't really feel that way sometimes, but I would say with respect to nonprofits, that has been a new attitude. So there was a fair amount of, I think, shame around failure or not being able to be successful with a program or fundraising or an event. And now, because everyone was really struggling under difficult circumstances, no matter who you were, the ability for nonprofit leaders to talk to each other and partner has really increased dramatically. So we have not been seeing a number of organizations who are quote unquote failing and need a rescue, and therefore could Arizona Together for Impact help them? What we have been seeing is organizations thinking way more strategically about their resources. So you brought up, I think, a shared services model, which I think is probably the #1 request I'm getting these days. How do we share space? How could we collaborate with this other organization around providing resources to a particular community? So I think those conversations are happening with a much higher level of frequency, which I'm extremely grateful for, because this is intended to be a long-term strategy initiative, not a short-term desperation move to, solve making payroll in the next 2 weeks or 1 month. One concern I would say I have, and this is anecdotal, you have the hard data there, Kristen, but a lot of the organizations that either I'm involved with personally or am getting calls from received PPP funding. And that helped, right? That helped bridge this pandemic and the desperation of not being able to have your fundraiser or having money pulled. But I'm a little concerned of what happens after PPP. And where organizations will be after that piece of funding dries up. So, and how quickly we'll be able to ramp back up for the fund development that organizations were doing previously. You're going to hit me with your question?
Yeah, no, you did a good job of answering pretty much all of them. Of course, I had doubt, and I think you answered the question we had from Flora. So thank you for that. And, I agree. It's folks who may not be as familiar either with the nonprofit sector or with the whole concept of mergers, acquisitions, permanent collaborations, it could say, well, why don't you just merge, or like you said, it can't be this quick solution to a temporary or a specific issue the nonprofit's facing. When you start to really think about what it takes to consider that type of move, to go through the process, to do your due diligence, I mean, it is a major undertaking that I think more people have been open to having a conversation about. And it's definitely something that should be seen as a strategic tool in your toolbox. It's going to work for some folks and it's not, but thinking about it, I know you and I, Nora, have had conversations about it doesn't have to be a negative term, right? When you start talking mergers and acquisitions in the nonprofit sector, folks tend to think, well, what happened? Where was the board? What did they do wrong? And it's like, well, sometimes it can be a very thoughtful, strategic move to strengthen the missions of the organization. So we really appreciate what you guys have done. And I said that, you guys launching right before this all started happening was very serendipitous, even though you haven't seen this influx that maybe you thought you would. The other influx we didn't see was nonprofits closing. A lot of our colleague states kind of sounded the alarms that they were seeing these nonprofits closing. And thankfully here in Arizona, we've seen, again, an influx of funding or support that has allowed many of them to remain open. But you're right, there's a cliff maybe coming after some of this emergency funding and additional funding through PPP or the EIDL economic injury disaster loans, or even from foundations. So really good points that you brought up. Thank you, Nora. And I'm going to switch over to Dr. Ashcraft and have a few questions for him as well. What do you see happening across Arizona nonprofits and from a macro level view?
Well, thank you, Kristen. And gosh, it's great to be a part of this conversation. And many thanks to Flinn Foundation. I feel, Kristen, I don't know about you, but a bit of an interloper having, because I'm not an alum I'm not a Flinn-Brown Fellow. So I'll just declare envy.
Me neither, I'm with you.
Envy, Kristen and I, so we're interlopers and we've been invited inside the tent. That's pretty cool. So this is a big question. First of all, Kristen, terrific job. I mean, I think painting this sort of picture, right? The pulse, as you call it at the Alliance, is extraordinarily important. And what I've been asked to do is just, take a look at that and say, well, how's it working for Arizona nonprofits? And then pull back a bit to your point on the macro level. So on the one hand, I could easily just say, absolutely everything noted by Kristen is what's happening. It's happening in Arizona nonprofits and nationally on most studies that have been done. There are some reveals, I think, out there looking at from a national perspective that might be helpful. The SAGE group, that's sort of a cloud corporation of knowledge data, and many nonprofits use their service, among others, did a study with a real technology lens. Across all of the respondents, they're saying 70% program disruption, challenges getting to a remote workforce. Half of their respondents said, yeah, well, that was easy. And the other half said this was a nightmare. They were caught a bit flat-footed. Issues of decrease in revenue and funding, which they sort of separate that out a bit, because you could actually, you could decrease in both at different levels depending about fee base, which could be revenue, but then also a foundation funding, of course, would be a grant. So pulling the lens back even further, I'll just sort of declare the following until somebody wants to argue about it, and that is, the sector is resilient. If you look at the arc of history to the first large pandemic that affected the United States, which, by the way, experts are saying killed 100 million people worldwide. And I'm going back to the 1900s pandemic. Issues of world wars, not only recessions, but depressions. I mean, I don't want to make this a doom and gloom conversation, but the point is actually shining the light on the resiliency of the nonprofit philanthropic sector. So we've seen then record numbers of nonprofits, record growth in philanthropy, and so on. But let's also just have a sobering moment to say this isn't just the pandemic. I mean, we've been faced with a reckoning, and the reckoning of racism, issues of social equity, global warming, a very polarized political environment, which has much to say and do about this sector. Dark money, I mean, we could go on, and an economy that's working great for many and terrible for others. Some economists are using the letter K to suggest there's plenty of folks doing just fine. Actually, they don't even need their stimulus check, so they ought to donate that right away to the Alliance or to their nonprofit of choice. But others actually are very hungry. They have issues. I don't need to tell all you this. Many on this call, you know exactly. This is space that you work in. But I would also argue then it's not about the nonprofit sector. It's about the results we seek. And I'll get to this in a minute in terms of how do we get to those results. And it's going to be less siloed by sector and more about things like collaboration and so on that, Kirsten, you've talked about and Nora intimated as well. So we are resilient. There's not one monolithic sector. I'm a member of a credit union. They've never done better than the pandemic. More people are saving. I talked to the CEO manager of it. And, well, they're doing great. By the way, you can look up their Form 990. They're a nonprofit as well. So I think we've got to also define what are we talking about the nonprofits? Are we talking about the charities that serve the most vulnerable? Or are we also including a much larger conversation that would include everything from an art museum to a trade association to many other nonprofit, to the Rio Rowing Club on Rio Salado and so on. So with that, this reckoning, I think, is important because one silver lining, can you believe it, of the pandemic year, I think, is those who influence structures and processes of the sector are really taking a deep look. Maybe they've had a chance to, in a weird way, exhale just a little bit to say, boards are not diverse. Our staff is not representative of the publics we serve and so on. And many of you are involved in these really difficult issues. So it's not about just cheerleading for the sector and perpetuating systems and processes and institutions we've always had. That's not working for a lot of people in our communities. So big kudos to the Alliance and some of the other people and organizations. I would like to think, we're one that are really pushing on these conversations around the issue of relevance, first and foremost, to the results we seek, and then ultimately to a better tomorrow, to community well-being. And so I was asked just briefly, so are there some best practices that have emerged? And I'll mention a few. I would call them promising. I never say best, because best for you may not be best for me. Some practice in one subsector nonprofit may actually not work in another. So we have to be a little careful. In the SAGE study, half of their respondents reported they're innovating. They're innovating their way through. Kirsten talked about this a bit and some examples. So some silver linings, and we've been tracking this on an innovation hub. You can look at the website, some stories of just people adapting in their organizations and then innovating. And some you might say, well, gosh, that's not a dramatic example, but if you think about it, well, nobody had thought about it before. So think of the Children's Museum. I love what they did, place-based, the one in downtown Phoenix. Yeah, you have to kind of go there. It's physically bound by its place. Well, in a pandemic, can't bring in children and families. So they put the museum in a box, and you can make a donation, a fee-based thing. They'll deliver you the museum at your house. Cool. Many of you have probably cruised the zoo. I mean, I thought, brilliant, been to the zoo a million times and never knew they could open up those gates and let you drive a car through. So it helped with earned income as well as let people realize the experience. And so I think and those are two really small examples. There are hundreds of examples. So a couple of other things to the point Kirsten made and Nora made, collaboration. It's in, okay. I applaud Flynn for the collaboration of the leadership network that they've worked, I think, for many years, to be sure, but I think even more so now during the pandemic, people getting connected that are offering and running leadership programs, the racial equity work, hard and important work that Valley Leadership is doing. Those are networks. And what I'm experiencing is a record turnout of people because people are cooped up and they can use Zoom. We can actually connect in many ways. So lots of, I think, reimagining structures and processing. The SAGE study said doubling down on relationships. Now is not the time to be transactional, hyper connected to donors, to volunteers, to the boards, and so on. It seems we have to mention the power of philanthropy. I think the pandemic year, among all those other disruptions and issues of justice and so on and so on. Now, what are we seeing? We're finally seeing the philanthropic industrial complex holding a mirror up to itself, saying, we've got to go about our business differently. Mackenzie Scott's work is disrupting philanthropy completely. And by the way, we should also, I think you mentioned, Kirsten, or maybe it was Nora, but the issue of operating, paying operating costs. Don't get people, grantees so bound up in your own processes that they can't do the good work. And let's remind ourselves, most foundations are nonprofits too. Many of them file Form 990s. They're all in the same data. Guess what? They're doing great, record profits, record stock market and endowments as well. So when you're on certain, and by the way, I'm stretching the point to make the point. There's exceptions in all of this. The role of technology, it's been talked about, but this move to remote workforce, volunteerism, I think it's been talked about. We can talk about more. Social media, some nonprofits are rocking in the social media space. And it's a great way to get young people engaged in other ways. Others, flat-footed, had no particular social media presence, very difficult. convenings around some nonprofits are saying we're getting record turnout to our board meetings. Like we're getting actual more than a quorum because in a weird way, the same stakeholders that are going to engage get through technology are able to do so. And Kirsten, I know the Alliance is certainly our case. I mean, we're seeing just incredible engagement of folks that they're not going to drive to Phoenix. They're not, but now they're engaged. And I know you've seen it as well. A couple last points, and then I'll hand off here. This virtual meeting, virtual convening, here's a couple of quotes that were made in the SAGE study about one from a human services nonprofit that said, we're collaborating with other organizations on a self-care strategy for our staff and for our volunteers, because that was so important in the pandemic. And we're learning so much from other nonprofits. I think the role of an infrastructure organization like the Alliance can grease that wheel, right? I mean, because you can accelerate the knowledge and the network that way, but that's happening. Strategic fundraising awareness. In some cases, in arts and culture, I'm looking at a quote of a humanities nonprofit. It was a forced pause that enabled them to focus on a long overdue reassessment of their business plan. And there are some places that are saying, you know what, because we've had to pause on some program, we've actually freed up some time, believe it or not, to dig through the files and reorganize. And I'm using that metaphorically speaking. Fundamental programming shifts to the core. Like a human service says, we've refocused on our core programming of food insecurity versus 5 other programs that were important but tangential to our core mission. So I would just say there's some really cool innovation led by who these aren't static organizations, they're people, they're innovators, they're purpose-driven individuals, volunteers, and so on that are really adapting and making it happen. Last thing, just future, it's going to be less about sector role and more about obtaining the results being sought. It's going to be intersector. It's not about government, marketplace of business, and nonprofit. It's the 3 sectors on all these issues. We're seeing that on all the various strategies, particularly in serving the most vulnerable. And we actually have a forum coming up April 28th, the notion of role of volunteers as essential workers. They certainly are right now. By the way, if anybody can volunteer, at all the vaccination sites, they put out a call because there's a stress going on needing more volunteers and all that, but volunteers as essential workers in other domains as well. So I'll stop there. Kirsten, hand back to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Robert. Some really, really, really good insight in there. And definitely some of the things that we hope, that we've seen during the last year that we also hope that will continue. So thank you so much for that. And, a couple of thoughts is, when you're talking about a reminder of, right, not everything we faced in the past year has been COVID specific. There has been a lot of other things that have impacted our own emotional and intellectual ability to continue working in the same fashion. And, I've seen also that COVID has unpacked and uncovered a lot of things that have been existing for a long time, systemic issues, either in social justice, racism, philanthropy. There's been a lot of things that have been riding under the surface, and COVID has kind of been like, yeah, these are issues and they really need to be addressed. And thankfully, some of the light has been shown on those. We need to continue, right, to further that as well. And this leads me into one of the questions that's been posed, and we're kind of moving into our Q&A session. So thank you. There's a question, related to what state policy changes would provide the greatest help to our Arizona nonprofits. And I'll let our panelists kind of think about that for a second. And I'll just say that, we have definitely seen an increased engagement in advocacy and public policy among our nonprofits over the past year, especially as it relates to the federal level with everything that started to come out with the relief packages, and realizing that nonprofits needed to have a voice around the table, or else we're at risk of not being included in the Paycheck Protection Program, not being able to apply for some of the economic injury disaster program funding, or a wide variety of other things where there was so much clamoring by the small business sector, by restaurant, tourism, all other fields that definitely needed the resources. But again, the nonprofit sector needed to be at that table. And we are very fortunate to see that happen federally, but also here in Arizona, because people were more willing to engage and be a part of that process. Someone had asked me, this is kind of a comical example, but early on, when the gyms and things had been able to reopen for a certain period and everything else was still closed, someone said, well, how did that happen? And I said, well, somebody's got some high paid lobbyists, making some noise at the federal level. And that's a lot of times how things happen, and we can make just as much noise. So any thoughts from any of our panelists? What do you think you need most in terms of either policy change or different changes that you need to be most effective that we should be advocating for? Feel free to unmute yourself and share with us.
I'll jump in. I think, actually, I don't work much in the policy area. That Robert would know far more than I do about this. But one of my observations is that the funding community is definitely coordinating and collaborating at a much higher level over the past year than I had seen previously. And part of that is I'm more under the covers than I used to be based on the kind of work I'm doing. But I have been so impressed, and I hope it continues, in their ability to coordinate with each other. And this is corporate as well as, traditional foundations and philanthropies have been in group meetings, getting together, figuring out what priorities are and figuring out how to get to the crux of them. And I think that goes a little bit to your point earlier, Robert, about, it's what's making a difference in our community and how do we fund that, and thinking more strategically and collaboratively, which is a much healthier way to fund in the sector than who do we know, who do we like, and how does it meet with our, with our guidelines. And I do think they're getting more active in policy, but, Kristen, you and Robert can probably address that more specifically.
I'll jump in if you don't mind.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think one of the things that rang true for a lot of colleagues, at least in my space, was that COVID highlighted so much of what we have already known, and it brought so much of the injustices and the need for services to the forefront and to the front conversation when, nonprofits are often the kind of the behind the scenes doing the work. And so I think in terms of policy, the things that we focus on, at least specifically with food, is food access and food insecurity is a symptom of poverty. It can't be in its own bubble and without addressing what are the larger causes that cause somebody to be food insecure. So, paid family leave is a big one, access to an affordable wage as the cost of living rises dramatically, access to housing, all of these things that I didn't use the word food at all that are absolutely affect the way that someone interacts with food and their food budget. And so policy-wise, I think, there is a lot of change happening in the funding community. There's a lot of momentum, but eventually the nonprofits are going to continue being the wheels, and shifting priorities are going to change some of those funding structures again. And that's when I think the policy piece becomes, critical and continues to be critical, is that as that philanthropy dollars change depending on need or where there's a kind of a focus area, there's still going to be those underlying symptoms of poverty. There's still going to be those need for livable wages. There's still going to need to be affordable housing. So that's where we center our policy focus. There are specific bills right now to expand Double Up Food Bucks, which is a critical program for SNAP users, and all kinds of food programs that are going to keep farmers on their land, which is a big one. I can go into the food side of it, but I think the underlying piece of it is that nonprofit sectors work to alleviate problems that people experience in this state. And there are a lot of policies in that respect that have been here before as problems and will continue to be here after the pandemic.
Elyse, that's so well said. Because that's around core systemic issues, that being aligned around that, again, it's not a nonprofit problem, a government problem, or a market problem. It's a community issue across our communities. If you see where United Way, if you were on the recent, 95th anniversary of where Mackenzie Scott's $25 million, they've pivoted to the anti-poverty. That, if we can solve the issue of poverty, right, then it's interesting how things like health disparities narrow, educational attainment increases, workforce development, all that. Having said all that, philanthropy remains a round-off area to government funding, and therefore you got to be involved in the policy space. And Kristen, you know that so well. It's why, the coming together as a sector with the work of the Alliance. And then the other collaborative kind PathCo, I mean, there's many other sort of organizations. We can't ignore the policy space. And I will say in our education work from many years ago, we were teaching nonprofit leadership management, philanthropic studies, all that, and really ignoring policy. Not anymore. I mean, everybody understands they're going to go into the field. It's not sufficient just to run a great program if you're trying to solve wicked problems.
Absolutely, Robert. You know, we sometimes joke, you know, at the Alliance that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And so if we're not part of those conversations, you know, we can expect that, you know, maybe our funding will get cut, or, you know, we won't be able to help shape those community policies and the way, you know, the laws by which we govern the state, right, that have an impact either on our organizations or they have an impact on the people that we serve. So that's very true. And we've definitely been thankful. Working from home, gotta love puppy. So thank you for those responses. We do have another question. Patrick McCorder asks, philanthropy is surely meeting the critical economic needs of low-income populations in these times, but are people talking about the potential rescue of arts organizations that have had to completely shut down for more than a year? Kind of what I alluded to earlier. It would be tragic to lose this robust arts and culture sector in Arizona that has really been flourishing lately. So thank you, Patrick, for that question. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Anything that you've seen from the arts and culture sector? I'm not sure, Elyse or Naketa, I know you're not in those sectors, but maybe some of our other panelists might have some thoughts as well.
So, hey, Patrick, I can just mention, I was on a recent call with a bunch of really interesting people, including the CEO of the Yerba Buena Arts and Culture Center up in the Bay Area of San Francisco. And this doesn't directly solve Arizona's issue. They're so active in the policy space right now. The idea of actually a livable wage for artists and funds set up for the creative class. So they're a nonprofit, but where they're going at this is to say, you know, this is a quality of life, aesthetic quality of life issue. We have to have vibrant arts and culture. Individual philanthropists will do their thing, but I was fascinated by this policy piece that they're working on with Governor Newsom and folks there. It might be something those in the arts culture space, the Alliance, you know, and I can send you a link. It might be interesting to pursue what's happening to build a bedrock of support for this important sector. It's a great concern that you raise.
You know, I'm actually a trustee of an arts organization in Arizona. And so I can speak a little bit firsthand. This is not with my Together for Impact hat on. And, you know, the first 6 months, I would say, of COVID were absolutely devastating. And it definitely posed the question of, will we be here next year? And I think many of the organizations face that same sort of gut-wrenching question. And as Patrick said, it's so much a part of our community, but it's all about, you know, getting together in person because most of the arts are performing arts. I will say a couple of different things. One is the federal funds available for this have really been, you know, a lifeline. The second is, this is where, speaking to what Naketa and Elyse both spoke to, this is where the creative juices come in. You know, this is a stress test. And so doing stuff virtually, I know some of the other organizations have found very creative ways to present their programming and their shows to the community so that they could keep live performance moving forward. And I think that some of these vehicles will continue. You know, you talk about, you know, getting people to your meetings because there's no more excuse about the traffic on the 202, right? You're meeting virtually, so you're there on time. And I think that's true with performing arts. So not everyone got to enjoy live art, live performance art. And now, thanks to, you know, our innovations, I'll say, around technology for many of these organizations, you know, we can all tour the Met. We're all active in these things. So I do think that it has forced a level of creativity that we didn't have previously.
Yeah, thanks so much, both Robert and Nora, for that. you know, when you talk about everything that's been made available virtually, you know, so much is available out there for free. And there's these pros and cons to that when you think of a nonprofit's ability to be sustainable, right? I mean, it's great in the fact that they're getting more.
Kristen, I think we've lost your audio.
I'm glad you said something, Matt. I think we're all scrambling, trying to figure out if it's us. Coming in.
How about now? Phone just dropped, but gotta love technology. So I'm not sure what all you heard of that, but great points, Nora, and definitely things that arts and culture are going to have to think about as they move forward to be more sustainable. So thanks for letting me know you lost me there. But I'm going to move to our next question. We had another one come through in the chat from Terry asking, is anyone looking at the mutual aid disruption of philanthropy and nonprofits? The idea that everyone has needs that should be met and that everyone has something to offer to help meet others' needs activates everyone as part of the solution, and thus we have the potential to get the scale that we need. So I don't know if any of our panelists are familiar with the mutual aid disruption. If you want to comment on that, I see Elyse has unmuted, so we'll go to you, Elyse.
Yeah, I like my first knee-jerk reaction is disruption makes me feel a little uncomfortable since mutual aid has been around for a long time in this country. And, you know, mutual aid started in the civil rights movement in many communities, and it has a history even before that. So in many ways, community members taking care of each other and themselves is nothing new. And it is and I think it's an important resource for community members who, even though we strive to reach them in the nonprofit sector, don't always have an outlet in some of the organizations that they see. And so we've actually worked really closely with some of the mutual aid work in Phoenix. We have a cooler that wasn't being used for a good chunk of the summer, so we were able to help get food and keep it healthy or keep it fresh as we were moving in and out of the summer months, and able to kind of provide capacity for them. And you know, that's not a competition for us. Like, food is never a competition. We should never pit one food organization against the other. So we were able to provide that resource so that people got the chance to eat. And so, yeah, I guess my like knee jerk is that I don't see it as a disruption. I see it's a continuation of a humanitarian service that we have always provided in our communities, and certainly other communities outside of the nonprofit work.
Great comments, Elyse. And yeah, I would agree. You know, I've seen a lot of walls be broken down during the pandemic where, you know, I hate to use the word competitive, but, you know, in a sector, and especially in a state like Arizona, a young state, there's not a lot of philanthropy like there is back east. There are not a lot of corporate headquarters. There can feel that there's this competitiveness. And I think a lot of times that's where the statements about, you know, there's too many nonprofits, we need to have less nonprofits, we need to have more nonprofits merging, is because there's this competitiveness for capital, if you will. There's the fundraising, but you're right. You know, the more opportunities that we have to support the community needs, the better. And figuring out how we do that together effectively and collaboratively is going to be really important. So thanks for your comments on that. Anyone else want to chime in on that? All right. I don't see any other questions in the chat. We've got just a few more minutes for Q&A, so feel free to add those to chat or to the Q&A section, and we'll be sure to get to as many as we can. While we're waiting to see if there's any others, I'm just going to ask one of my final questions for each of our panelists. You know, what are your hopes, either for your specific nonprofit, Naketa and Elyse, or for the nonprofit community here in Arizona over the next 12 months? What do you hope to see?
That's such a big question. So I would say first and foremost, we hope to still be here because there's still some uncertainty as in these times. So that's first and foremost. We're hoping that we can provide the service that we provided pre-COVID. So not only just being here providing minimal service, but get back up, ramp back up to where we were pre-COVID, being able to provide that service to our young adults who are aging out of foster care, who are struggling a lot during COVID with the isolation, right? And so a lot of our kids already have trauma, but then also now they have to isolate. And so we're hoping that we're here and that we're able to get to a place where we're able to get back to our pre-COVID capacity.
Yes, we hope that as well, Naketa. Thank you for what you all do in the community. It's so important. Who else would like to go next?
Kristen, I'll just go to say, if we're just sort of looking in the future and what are our hopes, I just would hope for a most relevant, effective, impactful sector as a real community asset, along with the business marketplace and government. Not as subrogated to. I know you sleep on that every night.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Robert. And we appreciate your leadership and what the center is doing for nonprofits. So thanks for being part of the call. Nora or Elyse?
Yeah, I'll jump in because you sort of alerted us that this question would be coming, and I have to say, for the past 24 hours, I've been coming up with, this, and it really comes down to I would like us to be fearless, and I don't really know all of that, but Kristen, you've done a remarkable job of really outlining the strength of the sector and how impactful we can be. And it's frustrating, having been an executive director, to operate in this, place of insecurity. And I really think, that's where I'd like to get. But thinking about this past year, I had the opportunity some years ago to hear Mary Catherine Bateson speak. And she had this quote that I wrote down and I've used many times, which is, "Experience has no value without reflection." And I think about this past year and with respect to philanthropy, and what they could learn. I should say, since I'm on the philanthropy side now, what we could learn and how we want to change the way we operate moving forward from nonprofits. And, Naketa talked about, being lean and being innovative and being resilient. So how do we operate in the nonprofit sector? And to evaluate our own adaptability, right? This was a big stress test, but it's not going to be the only one we ever have. I'm old enough. I was in the first Flinn-Brown class. I'm old enough to have been through several stress tests, and it's coming again. And so it's really important to be thinking about that as we move forward. You have an opportunity to rebuild right now. How do you want to rebuild differently? And so I do see a big opportunity here as we move forward and hopefully move forward fearlessly.
Nora,
I love that,
was
Nora.
beautiful. Thank you. I needed to hear that. I'm going to actually take that back to my board. So thank you. That was very helpful. Thank you, Nora.
Yeah, I love it, Nora. And you're absolutely right. This is not the last time that something like this is going to happen, right? And in our lifetimes, I'm sure I could speak, I think for everyone, this is the most major thing. I've not lived through a pandemic before. And so what have we learned and how can we better prepare for the next time? A lot of nonprofits I know have started doing contingency planning for the first time, right? Have looked at a crisis management plan. They've looked at what happens if we do have to close the entire office. Can we work remotely? Some folks seamlessly moved over to that. Other folks absolutely had no resources available to do that. So thanks so much for that, Nora. Really appreciate that. Elyse, have we heard from you?
Yeah, that was excellent. And I think kind of building off of what everybody said, it's just the hope and understanding that, I've used your report for years, Kristen, in various roles in the nonprofit sector to say, look, we're legitimate, like we're here, we employ so many people. And I think it still comes to, and this is pre-COVID too, of the nonprofit sector takes on more and more of what is basic fundamental human needs and human, services. And the hope is that people continue to understand not only how valuable and important nonprofits are, how much we deserve to be paid, how much we deserve as innovators to be seen as entrepreneurial innovators and paid accordingly too, right? But also how much of an important role we play because those services aren't guaranteed for everybody. And so I think the next thing is to legitimize basic human need as not charitable work, right? And like we can all play a role in that as nonprofits, we can all play a role in that as individuals. Is we are here, we're not going anywhere. Nonprofits are going to continue to take care of their own the best way that they can. But what does that look like when we start to legitimize access to food as a basic human right, access to clean air as a basic human right, access to water as a basic human right? And what does that look like as a sector when we can start to push forward and say, hey, we've been doing this work for years, here's how it's measured. We operate under budget constraints and that, that insecurity mindset, but also our budgets have to look this way and cross this T, and yet we're doing the same fundamental work to keep people alive, to keep roofs over people's heads. So that is my hope. That is my hope pre-COVID. That is my hope during and post-COVID, that we start to legitimize nonprofit work, not as just this like feel good extra thing, as a fun additional sector, but as a legitimate and critical and life-saving piece that I think most of the people on this call know, but it's sometimes harder to translate into the policy piece and things like that.
Yeah.
So,
oh man,
Elyse,
Elyse.
Do we have a minute, Kristen?
Yeah, go ahead, Robert.
Now I'm responding because that's terrific. I mean, right on. Would only add, we operate in contested spaces in community. A very nonprofit with one point of view. There's another nonprofit with a 180-degree point of view. And I'll give just one example. We don't need to talk the issue, but I just want to give the example of the issue. On the same day, we get a lot of calls. Two different calls came in, each from an executive director. So they have a board and staff and all that. One was pro-life and one was pro-choice, each having sort of questions about some board issues. Now, I found that very interesting. So we don't take a stand on that issue of abortion and the right of a woman to choose. However, it just hit everybody right square between the eyes. The nonprofit sector is in contested space. So we have to understand that, because the same space that we could all come around on this kind of call and agree to, there may be others that have a completely different point of view. They too operate in the nonprofit sector. So, and by the way, Alexis de Tocqueville would say that's called democracy in America, right? I mean, we operate in these interesting spaces that aren't always popular enough for government to take on at any level, and not profitable for the marketplace. That's the space of the sector too. So I love what you said. In fact, I'd like to bottle that up, because that's a beautiful thing. It's also just a reminder that, we may fundamentally disagree with a whole bunch of nonprofits based on our own personal ideology. And they have legitimacy too in the theory of the sector.
Yeah, thanks for that, Robert. And it made me think about, Elyse, when you're talking, I mean, I was like up on your soapbox too, like, can I scoot over and like stand right next to you? Because such important things that you said. And it made me think about, that it's in times like these when folks realize how much they need a sector like the nonprofit sector. And unfortunately, with so much attention and support coming right now, which is great and is needed, it's like, we want to make sure that this continues, or it would have been great if there was the attention before, so that when we really need the nonprofit sector, that they're here for us. Because there's so many people who have never needed a food box, who have never needed shelter, who have never needed someone to talk them through suicidal thoughts, who have never needed the services of a nonprofit. I get chills just talking about it, because it's in times of crisis, right, that normally we're turning to nonprofits. Arts and culture also, right, is critically important. Animal welfare is critically important, but we don't really sometimes think about it until we need it, or that it's a passion of ours. And so it's really important that we support nonprofits, not only in times of great crisis, but also throughout the year. I think of like Arizona 211. What a great resource for Arizonans. And it was challenged and had to almost shut down completely. It went to, just recorded information in the website. And then the pandemic rolls around, and it's like, wouldn't it be great if we had a number of people could call to get, COVID information and resources? And we're like, we have 211, or we have this nonprofit, and if we support them and build them up throughout the year, then they will be there for us when we need them the most. So you all are great examples of that. I really appreciate all of you being a part of this panel and for the work that you do in our communities. It's just tremendous. And the fact that you've been resilient and have done what you need to do to take care of not only your own teams, but those that rely on you. We really appreciate that. So there might have been a question or two I didn't get to, but I'm sure the team at Flinn Foundation will capture those, and I'm happy to answer any of those. I'm sure our panelists would be happy to do that afterwards. So I'm just going to do some final wrap up. I wanted to thank the Flinn Foundation team for putting this on. I really appreciate our foundations like Flinn Foundation who are willing to have these conversations. So thank you for putting this together. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this. And just a reminder, a copy of the webinar and the presentation will be included in a follow-up email that is sent from the Flinn Foundation team, and the materials will also be available on their website. So unless anybody has any closing responses or anything else that I've missed, I will grant you about 2 minutes back to your day. Thank you all so much for joining us and for your ongoing support. And yes, I will do a shameful plug that Arizona Gives Day is coming up again next Tuesday. It's hard to believe, or the Tuesday after next Tuesday, April 6th. So make sure you support your favorite nonprofit on that day and throughout the rest of the year. So thank you all so much. Hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.